from the archaeological record of the wall and its environment.
If you want to know about the structure of the wall and trying to understand the way that it was put together and the way that it changed through time as a structure, then that's through straightforward structural archaeology, through excavation, through the observation of the remains.
Part detective story, part architectural analysis. What we know of Hadrian's Wall is a saga archaeologists and historians continue to write. They have learned much of the wall and of the people who lived there, but they have come to realize how much more there is still to learn.
People have been working on Hadrian's Wall for many years, but I now get the impression that we don't know anything about Hadrian's Wall at all, because every time we excavate a new site or we look at a new survey, we discover that some of our closely held ideas about Hadrian's Wall don't stand up.
Hadrian's Wall is an imperfect but tantalizing time machine. With some effort and imagination, it can transport us back to an era we would hardly recognize.
Let's forget immediately that there's an idea of a Britain as we might understand it as a country or a nation. It doesn't exist. So there is a tribe in southeast Britain, there is a tribe a little bit further north, there's another tribe further to the west of that. And they spend nearly all their time fighting one another, little territorial disputes.
While these local tribes were fighting each other, farmers eked out a humble living in their Iron Age roundhouses, like this recreation in northern England.
Now that means, literally, a round house made of wood, straw, packed with earth, and with a conical roof, a little like a teepee, with one entrance. You go through the door, and you're going to see a huge fire in the middle. And that fire and the smoke goes up through the roof, but the heat expands out and keeps the whole place a wonderful warm environment. Dark by our standards and no windows, probably.
These tribal people probably lived this way for hundreds of generations.
A king rises up, he's a powerful man. The next king in the next tribe is weak. They have battles, the territory is taken, another generation passes and it's a different world. And they spend their time doing that, all the while aware that the Roman Empire is there across the English Channel.
The Roman Empire was not just across the Channel. It encompassed all of Europe, south and west of the Rhine and Danube rivers. It extended east as far as the Caspian Sea, south into Africa to the sands of the Sahara, and west to the Atlantic Ocean. It was an enormous empire that controlled nearly the entire known world, or at least the world known to the Romans. By the time Rome began setting its sights on Britain, it had been a civilization for more than 500 years. The keys to Rome's unprecedented success were adaptability and organization. The Romans excelled at gobbling up cultures and deftly incorporating them into their empire.
The Romans have an extraordinarily efficient system. They are the first modern superstate. They have a whole legal order. They have a whole architectural order. They have quite simply the most powerful army the world has ever seen.
The Romans showed remarkable tolerance for the local customs and traditions of conquered peoples, but they also imposed much of their own culture, which in the long run often proved beneficial.
But if you think about these ordinary people, they had lived in a world in which their tribal chieftains could take their land, ride roughshod over them, take all their spare produce, take all the profit from the farm. When the Romans arrive, they have access to new markets, to new goods, they have recourse to legal justice. When they get their estate, it's actually written down on a docket and it's stored in the public buildings. Now, there's plenty of corruption in the Roman world, but one has to recognize that for many people, the coming of the Romans meant a much, much, much better way of life.
The Romans, with their rational, organized worldview, influenced every aspect of the lives of their subject peoples. From architecture and government to language, even baths.
For the Roman, to go to a bath is not just a question of getting washed. It's a question of relaxing in an environment with friends where you steam up, you oil up, and you cool off. The Roman bath is a complex stone structure with vaulted roofs. You need the vaults because if you have wooden roofs, they'll rot in the steam and fall in. So you've got the high level of Roman architecture going into building a Roman bathhouse. You don't just rush in, have a wash, do your hair and run off and carry on with the work. This might be something you would set a large part of the day aside for.
The idea of a sophisticated Roman bath, such as this reconstruction, in the wilds of cold, forbidding England, must have seemed crazy to many in the Roman capital. But the momentum that kept Rome functioning depended on constant expansion, and England was the next frontier for ambitious emperors, despite trepidation on the part of soldiers at the front.
We hear of soldiers who were prepared to mutiny rather than sail to Britain in the early days of conquest. And even after that, there was always this feeling that Britain was on the edge of things, that you had to be jolly careful when you got beyond Britain. You might fall off.
In the year 55 BC, Julius Caesar became the first Roman leader to invade Britain. It was the beginning of a long, tempestuous relationship with Rome that would last for nearly 500 years. Although Hadrian's Wall is 80 Roman miles long, a Roman mile is slightly shorter than our modern mile. Hence, Hadrian's Wall is only 74 miles long. Hadrian's Wall? Julius Caesar invaded Britain because he thought it would be an easy way to bask in the glory of military conquest. Although he never followed up his earlier invasions with more serious efforts, one of his successors, the Emperor Claudius, did in AD 43.
As we are specifically told by the Roman writer Suetonius, Claudius required a triumph. He required military prestige. And of course the same thing happens today. We see dictators going in for foreign adventures in order to bolster their own domestic position, to help pull their country together.
Britain is this supremely exotic place on the end of the world. Not exotic in the sense that it's full of palm trees and girls with not very many clothes on. It's exotic in the sense that it's dark and mysterious. And to win Britain is to show the Roman people that even now, we Romans can capture this place at the end of the world, even though, in all honesty, it's really worthless. But it's a mark of our largesse as Roman people that we can take this place and bring our wonderful civilization. Because that's the other side of the Romans. They really believed that they were doing people favors.
The tribal kings didn't quite see things that way and put up a vigorous if doomed resistance. Over a period of 40 years, aggressive Roman military governors, notably Gnaeus Julius Agricola, were able to subdue most of the island of Britannia.
They were people with their own, if you like, respectable history. They had some political sophistication. When threatened by the Romans in the 80s under Agricola, they combined together their forces to fight Agricola, and although they lost, their instincts were correct. Now, we know during the Roman period that there were treaties governed the relationship between the Romans and the people beyond the frontier.
The Romans pushed through Britain, establishing larger cities at Colchester and London, and smaller bases in places like York and Chester. Villages grew up around these bases, with the usual parade of gamblers, prostitutes, and vendors. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, settled uneasily throughout the land, and soon coins, gods, and goods filtered through.
I think popular misconception is that it was basically Italians in the army and road-painted, fur-clad locals stomping around outside. This would have been a very, very cosmopolitan area in the Roman period. There were people from all over the Roman world, either in the army or following the army as merchants and traders. There were mixed marriages between soldiers and girls from all over the Roman world. There would have been goods from all over the Roman world.
At the end of the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire in Britain extended as far north as present-day Scotland. Further expansion in Britain was delayed in order to quell uprisings along the Danube, and this was a pattern that ultimately thwarted a complete occupation of the island. But another factor was becoming apparent. The Roman Empire had reached its maximum sustainable size. It could no longer simply expand.
Up till now, the idea was that everywhere that Romans had set foot, they stayed. The Romans could beat anybody around at the time, and basically went on going until you hit water or something else, or desert. It was a very odd idea to stop, and yet, realistically, and there had to be a point to stop, a point to say, this far and no further.
This was an utterly foreign concept to most Romans, but one that the Emperor Hadrian, who came to power in AD 117, understood.
Hadrian realized that the empire could not continue to expand. It could not put its troops everywhere and continue to control all his frontiers. Hadrian was a great believer that the empire had come to its natural limits. He set the borders. He is the first Roman emperor to say, we are going no further.
Well, Hadrian seemed to have the idea that the empire had got as big as it comfortably could be. And not only in Britain, but in Germany too, and probably in North Africa, he seemed to go for the idea of establishing a visible frontier, a line.
Born in Spain, Hadrian improved legal administration and the civil service. He was a lover of Greek culture and an accomplished architect who designed the Pantheon in Rome. His most significant contribution, however, may have been his efforts to keep his soldiers well trained and disciplined, despite the relative peace under which he ruled. One way he did this was to put them to work, building barriers along the newly fixed Roman frontier.
In Germany, he cut the corner, really, between Rhine and Danube with just a palisade. That was enough. It said where Rome began and the barbarians ended. And it had the same basic message. We've got enough. This is ours. Please knock on the door and wait till somebody opens it.
When he came to Britain, this was perhaps an opportunity for him to experiment with a different kind of architecture, but we also know that he was very, very displeased with soldiers who weren't doing anything. He was very bothered about frontier garrisons that were made up of lazy troops. So it's my personal theory that one of the reasons for Hadrian's Wall may have been to give the soldiers in Britain something to do.
We know that Hadrian came to Britain to inspect the frontier in AD 122. Almost certainly, the idea for the wall and orders to carry it out occurred during this visit. Most likely, Hadrian saw that the Staingate Road, an established trade route between the Solway Firth and the mouth of the River Tyne, was a suitable location for a barrier. Britain is relatively narrow here, and natural boundaries like steep crags, ponds, and rivers would augment whatever man-made boundary the soldiers could build. Nearby quarries could provide the stone, and the existing frontier forts along the Staingate Road could provide men. All of the elements for an ambitious and unprecedented frontier fortification were in place when Hadrian left Britain, never to return, never to see the wall, which would be his most monumental legacy. Next, construction begins. In the early days, most Roman soldiers along Hadrian's Wall came from other Roman territories, such as Northern Europe and Africa. Few had ever seen Rome. Hadrian's decision to build a wall along the British frontier marked the start of a new era for the Romans.
Hadrian's Wall, in a sense, is a sort of a defining monument of the Roman Empire. It represents, first of all, a critical stage when the period of expansion had come to an end and the empire essentially achieved a defensive posture. That wasn't necessarily going to continue for every emperor after Hadrian, but in a sense, Hadrian drew a close to the period of constant expansion.
The northern limit of the empire would be delineated in stone and mortar.
The building of the wall, of course, was a major engineering achievement. It presumably started with survey parties going out. We're pretty sure they're using vision a lot. You can see the way now in which the line of the wall changes on top of a hill as the surveyors sight through and get their next alignment worked out. Obviously, they've got to know their general direction, east-west, but then they've got to do it in terms of a number of short, straight lengths.
To facilitate construction, the wall was divided into sections, which were independently constructed by units of the Roman army, which included among its ranks skilled builders and other artisans.
Now, the ones who name themselves for us are members of the 2nd Legion Augusta, the 6th Legion Victrix, and the 20th Legion Valeria Victrix. That's the 3 main legions that formed the garrison of Britain, but they were probably helped by the auxiliary non-citizen troops as well. What we know is that they were given blocks of the wall to build, and they had to mark the blocks that they had built, each group of soldiers, as a quality control, so that the Roman army command could say, that is one hell of a bad bit of wall, and there's a stone at the end that actually says who built it, and the guy who was responsible for that could be toasted for it.
As originally conceived, the wall was to be made of stone for the easternmost 2/3, as in this reconstruction, with turf blocks and timber making up the remaining third. Solid turf was cut from the ground into surprisingly strong and stable blocks and stacked up to build a wall. The wall was studded at regular intervals along its south side with fortified gates, known as mile castles, which allowed limited access through the wall. Two turrets ascending above the wall proper would be evenly spaced between each mile castle. Men from already established forts behind the wall served shifts at the border. Beyond the wall to the north, a ditch 10 feet deep would be dug as an additional barrier, except in places where the natural landscape made it unnecessary. In 3 locations, the wall crossed rivers as fortified bridges.
You start counting up in terms of millions of stones used in the wall. And of course, the business of building this over 70-odd miles. One wonders really how many people were killed in the process of building Hadrian's Wall.
I wish we knew how long it had taken to build it. It's very difficult to imagine. It would have taken several years, but we know that they kept changing their minds about what they were going to have. And they were still putting in forts and tweaking bits and pieces of it in 133 AD.
The decision was made to convert the turf wall in the west into stone. But the new wall did not exactly follow the path of the old one. The stone wall was originally planned to be 10 feet thick, but that dimension diminished to 8 feet, and even 6 as work progressed, possibly to economize. Later, it was decided to build a number of forts directly next to the wall, rather than to rely only on the existing forts to the south. This required major reworking of the wall. Even later, another ditch, called a vallum, was dug 10 feet deep and 20 feet wide, with mounds on both sides. But this ditch was to the south, or inside the wall, not the north or frontier side.
So it creates a sort of wall zone with quite strict control on people coming into it from the south, from the province itself, as well as, of course, to protect the control from the north. So it's as if the situation's changed a bit, and they're just that little bit more wary. If you had some nastily inclined people, they could walk up to a tower and cut the throats of the people in it, which wouldn't, on the whole, make for good relationships.
Late in the process, the Romans decided to build a road south of the wall, but inside the wall zone created by the vallum. This military way connected the forts, mile castles, and turrets. Did the wall make an impression on the local farmers as they watched it twist and curl like a snake over the hills and valleys further west? Did it demonstrate for them the strength of the empire? There were more impressive structures in Rome: marble temples and amphitheaters, delicate gardens. Hadrian's Wall was rough, blunt power.
Now, the wall itself is really quite simple, at times almost, one might say, clumsy. It's not a great piece of work because it wasn't intended to be finished off as one of the great monuments of Rome or Athens, but it was a good workmanlike achievement, an engineer's work rather than architect's.
By the middle of the 2nd century, a visitor to the frontier traveling from the south would have been stopped by the vallum. Crossings at the vallum were provided only at forts. Forts were rectangular with rounded corners and were enclosed by high stone walls. 4 fortified gateways normally graced all 4 sides. Each fort contained barracks for the men of the garrison, the home of the commanding officer, workshops, storehouses, and a headquarters building. This building was the focus of the fort, which contained administrative offices and a shrine. Outside the fort, a civilian settlement dependent on trade from the soldiers would likely have grown up, including row houses, an inn, taverns, and shops. The bath would also have been found outside the fort, as would the cemetery. Traveling along the military way, a visitor would have come across turrets rising above the wall with a 2nd story and access to the wall top. Only a handful of men would be stationed at a turret, which would have provided a view of the surrounding countryside. Further down would be a mile castle, again rising to the height of the wall and containing a stairway to the wall top. The square-shaped mile castle would have included a center road leading through the wall gate. Other small buildings and housing for about a dozen men indicate a larger but still modest force. And then the wall itself, reconstructed here, likely rising to a height of about 15 feet. But there is much that we still don't know about the wall even today.
We know about how wide the wall was, how it was built, but what happened at the top is open to discussion. Some people think it was crenellated, others think it was flat, others think it was shaped as a slope so the rain fell off it. At the moment, we're not totally clear.
One of the stereotypes which is most difficult to take out of our minds is the fact that Hadrian's Wall was manned by soldiers who lined up along the top to repel attack. Firstly, the wall itself militates against this. The top is actually quite narrow, so it's not easy to move along it, assuming that it was possible to move along it.
I think if you have a wall and you can't really get on top of it, you're limiting your possibilities.
Of course, another problem relating to the appearance of, was it painted? Well, the excavations I carried out, it was only one stone, but that stone certainly seemed to indicate that it had been painted.
I personally think that this is just the lime mortar from between the stones being leached down by rainwater.
Whatever its ultimate shape, size, or color, by the middle of the 2nd century, Hadrian's Wall was complete, solid, and functioning, clearly marking the furthest reaches of the Roman Empire. Having accomplished this remarkable feat, the Romans under a new emperor moved their border 100 miles further north and largely abandoned Hadrian's Wall. Next, the Antonine Wall, made entirely of turf and timber. Beyond the westernmost portion of Hadrian's Wall on the Irish Sea, the system of mile castles and turrets continued along the seashore, even though no wall was ever built there. Hadrian's Wall. Antoninus Pius, Hadrian's successor, continued Rome's tradition of expansion and pushed the border of Rome's northern frontier even further north into present-day Scotland, where he built a turf and timber wall known as the Antonine Wall that ran for 40 miles roughly between modern Edinburgh and Glasgow.
Now, of course, the important question is, why did this happen? We used to think that it was perhaps because of warfare north of Hadrian's Wall, which entailed a forward move of the frontier. But more recent thought has suggested that it may be simply no more than the fact that the new emperor, who had never served in the army, wanted to improve, or rather establish, his military credentials by a victory.
Obviously, the wall hasn't got the same structure as a stone wall. It has to be much wider, and it doesn't have a sheer face to the outsides. But it can still represent a formidable barrier. And this, in a sense, was the traditional Roman military building material.
But within 15 or 20 years, the Romans returned to occupy Hadrian's Wall as the main demarcation of the empire, abandoning the area north except for a handful of frontier forts.
And the abandonment of Hadrian's Wall for that brief period and the building of the Antonine Wall, they may be no more than a pawn in this much wider and, for the Emperor Antoninus Pius, obviously, more significant game.
It is wrong, however, to think of Hadrian's Wall as simply a bulwark against rowdy barbarian hordes. Its purpose was multifaceted and complex.
It's not a castle wall. It's not really wide enough to fight from, and the Roman army didn't do that sort of fighting. What they preferred to do was to get out on the ground and round you up, give you a thrashing, generally give you the impression that you didn't mess with the Romans. So from their point of view, they didn't want to stand up on the wall and wave spears at people. They wanted to go out through all those gates and get to close quarters with anybody who needed education about the Roman peace.
But the people on the far side of the wall weren't necessarily armed attackers. There were long peaceful periods in which people and trade certainly moved back and forth through the wall. But such contact and communication needed to be controlled, because those coming from the north were from beyond the empire, and they were potentially hostile.
You see, the way to understand it best is to think if there wasn't a wall, however carefully you patrol, however much you have soldiers on the ground, somebody can slip through. You can raid, you can infiltrate, you can make a nuisance of yourselves. But once you've got a wall there, you try and go cattle lifting and you find you've got to lift your cattle over a 15-foot high wall. You want to bring all your booty back, you put on wagons and you find you've got to go through a gate where somebody asks where you got all that from.
And if we take a modern analogy, we can see this very clearly with the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall clearly stopped people moving across it, but it would not have stopped a major invasion one way or the other. It would have held up the tanks for a little while, but otherwise it wouldn't have stopped them. It was, if you like, the edge of Caesar's land. It allowed the Romans to control people moving in and out of the province, but it wasn't there to protect the province as such. That was done by the soldiers based in the forts on the wall.
Those soldiers stationed at each turret and mile castle at every fort along the wall brought a sense of continuity to the frontier, as generation after generation of men lived and died on the far edge of the Roman Empire. Auxiliary soldiers stationed near the wall included mixed infantry and cavalry regiments, which consisted of 500 men. Infantry-only regiments of 500 men were also stationed there, as were mixed and infantry cohorts, which contained twice as many men as a regiment, at 1,000 men strong. Cavalry regiments were somewhat rare. Men who enlisted in the Roman army were required to remain for 25 years, which was not the hardship it seems.
You're assured of food, of clothing, of medical care, mustn't forget that. And you've got a pretty good expectation of life compared with the people outside the army, which may seem funny, but an army is a very safe place in peacetime. You know, you went through the motions, you did your basic training, you drank with your mates, you had a bit of a gamble, and at the end of that time, while you were a Roman citizen and your children were Roman citizens, and probably when you'd done your 25 years, all you did was walk down a hill, take a house in the civil settlement, and yarn with the lads about how things were when you were in the army.
After a while, the army was likely able to recruit the sons of soldiers who retired outside the fort to the local civil settlement, or vicus. This pattern probably continued for hundreds of years, so that the frontier was not only an assignment, it was home for those stationed there.
Let's imagine that we're arriving at a Roman fort. And we don't just go into the Roman fort, we go through a whole civilian community outside the fort servicing the Roman army. This is where bars are, where brothels are, where all sorts of activities are going on, perhaps even the soldiers' wives and families living outside. Within the fort itself, we have a superbly organized structure with gates, fortifications, and inside the barrack buildings, a hospital. Every day the soldiers here are dealing with normal fatigues. They've got to march, they've got to sort their equipment out. They also have some leisure time. There's going to be the smell from blacksmiths. And there are also going to be the prostitutes. One thing you can guarantee, that wherever a soldier goes, the oldest profession in the world goes with it. It's an absolute fact of life. So this is a whole thriving underclass world of commerce and prostitution and ordinary families. It's really the whole of humanity, but it's driven by the Roman army with those soldiers with the pay, which is why when we get to the end of the Roman world and the pay stops arriving for the soldiers on Hadrian's Wall, these communities disappear.
Britain was, after all, on the outskirts of the empire, on the fringe. In 306, Emperor Constantine took the throne and later moved the center of Roman civilization eastward to Constantinople. Slowly but inexorably, the Roman Empire was falling apart. By then, soldiers on the frontier were as much British as Roman, maybe more so. The world was passing Hadrian's Wall by. In the civil settlement at Housted's Roman fort, archaeologists discovered evidence of an ancient double murder hidden beneath the foundation of a longhouse. In 410 AD, Rome officially abandoned Britain. Decline began years earlier. The number of men on the frontier had certainly been reduced. There was no mass exodus to Rome by soldiers who had grown up in the shadow of the wall. There was no great battle to wrest the island from the Romans. But Britain was gradually left to its own devices, until finally, after over 350 years of Roman rule, it was on its own again.
Hadrian's Wall at the end is a ramshackle Mad Max world of propped up gates, which have fallen over, repaired with bits of wood, blocked up. What's probably the case is that we may have communities that are starting to control the local area a little bit like those tribal chieftains all those years ago before the Romans came. And then when the system finally collapses, we may have these military communities turning into the sort of groups resembling those tribes that we had in Britain beforehand, controlling little pockets of territory.
All that Rome established began to fall away. Lawlessness and illiteracy crept back, and forgetfulness. The wall began to crumble.
And of course it remained a boundary. Farmers observed it. It was never actually a boundary between England and Scotland, but it was a field boundary and continued in that way.
The wall became a quarry, as people would remove stones to build farmhouses or fences, or even early churches. As Christianity, the last great gift of the Roman Empire, had made its way to the furthest reaches of the once great civilization. Knowledge of the Roman presence in Britain was soon nearly totally lost. The Venerable Bede, early father of English history, lived in his monastic cell in Newcastle in the 7th century, only 200 years after the Romans left.
Now, when he looked out of his cell window in the 620s, thereabouts, he could see the wall. I mean, you know, it would have been standing to its full height then. And in his description of Hadrian's Wall, he relied on information he got from other people and told us that the wall was built in the middle of the 5th century, which is after the Romans have gone from Britain. So, you know, there's someone, an intelligent man, living relatively close to the period, didn't know anything about it.
Dilapidated forts became headquarters for roving bands of local highwaymen, called reavers. Some mile castles were converted to bastle houses, or fortified farmhouses with animals on the ground level and living quarters above. Over the next 1,000 years, as territorial battles between England and Scotland played themselves out on the slopes and crags of Northumberland, nearly all the structures slowly collapsed, except the wall itself. When stability returned to the region in the 17th century, estates were granted and tenant farmers returned, and interest in the ancient wall began to rekindle among the historically inclined, although not all of the early deductions were accurate.
Christopher Ridley, the curate of the local church in Holtwell, he reported, for example, that Roman chariots driving along Hadrian's Wall. Well, anyone who's seen Hadrian's Wall and realized the ups and downs of the wall would know that they'd have to have steps in the wall, for God's sake, and no chariot would possibly get along it. He also had the idea that they had a speaking tube, a bronze speaking tube, all the way along the wall for talking to each other, and claimed that this bronze speaking tube was still maintained by the local bigwigs today. You know, absolute drivel.
People began to explore the wall. Occasionally, a public works program would dislodge and reveal a portion previously unseen. By the late 19th century, a group of educated historians and boosters began to excavate along the wall.
I think the most important person for the history of excavation on Hadrian's Wall was John Clayton. He was very interested in archaeology because his family home was at Chester's, and this seemed to have got him very interested, and over the years he bought up stretches of Hadrian's Wall as it became available, and he excavated quite a number of them.
Artifacts began to find their way into museums. Discoveries began to make their way into the news. Hadrian's Wall was rescued from the brink of obscurity. John Clayton's collection of artifacts found along the wall can still be seen in the museum built near his home at the Roman fort of Chester's, built shortly after his death in 1890 at age 98. Excavation and preservation throughout the 20th century have salvaged much of what was left. In 1987, Hadrian's Wall was named a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. As it once did for the Romans, Hadrian's Wall continues to function in a number of capacities. It is a tourist attraction for visitors to the north of England, and it is an archaeological treasure trove. Robin Burley has spent much of the 30-plus years he's been excavating the Roman fort of Vindolanda, extracting delicate papyrus documents, upon which all sorts of information was written by the men stationed there.
One of the first documents we got was a private letter coming in from one lady, the wife, as it turned out, of another commanding officer, to our commanding officer's wife, inviting her to a birthday party on the 11th of September in a year wasn't mentioned, but it's probably 103, 104 AD. Now, that was the first hint that even the earliest garrisons up here, they brought their wives and families with them.
Not all of Burley's discoveries are as dramatic as that, however.
Now, you know, the odd person watching us excavate when we bring up a boot or a shoe think, boy, that's exciting. My record number of boots and shoes is 75 in a day, which they chuck into old ditches. You see, they never disintegrate. You can't burn leather. They're all hanging about. We have on display in our museum here the largest collection of footwear in the Roman world. We've got about 140 boots, shoes, sandals, slippers on display, which looks terrific. I've got another 2,500 upstairs.
Part of being an archaeologist along Hadrian's Wall means being willing to jettison long-held beliefs in the face of recently unearthed evidence to the contrary.
Every year also, one or two of the cherished theories of the past are demolished. Something new appears. What on earth does that mean? And you know, you've got to go back to the drawing board and try and work it all out. I don't think more than 5% of the whole thing has ever been researched, and we'll still be researching Hadrian's Wall in 1,000 years' time.
Recently uncovered row upon row of traditional roundhouses within the fort of Vindolanda. These houses have never been found within a Roman fort before, and speculation suggests they may have been used to house barbarian hostages during an uprising. There is still much we can learn from the wall if we bend and listen closely. Nothing lasts 2,000 years without imparting some insight on survival, persistence, adaptability.
I think the wall then represents this phase in which Britain suddenly becomes part of a much greater European culture. It's obviously been part of that in prehistoric terms, but in those few centuries, it becomes a significant element of that system. And it reminds us of living today that we are part of not just a single island, but of a much greater community.
Today, the wall no longer separates. It helps us bridge the gap between then and now, to teach us that we are part of one community. The community of man, living and dead.
It still strides across the landscape. It still gives you a feeling of the might of the greatest empire that the world has ever seen, the Roman Empire. And it's justifiably the most famous, the most well-known, and dare I say it, the best-loved Roman frontier surviving today.